Washington Journal continues.
Our next guest is Colonel Cedric Leighton. He is a retired former military intelligence officer from the U.S. Air Force. He was also formerly deputy director at the NSA, and he now runs his own consulting firm, Cedric Leighton Associates, based in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today,
Colonel. It's my pleasure, Lon. Thanks so much for having me this morning.
I'd like to start with just getting your assessment of the most recent developments in Iraq. Where do we stand and where do we go from here?
Well, I think that the most recent thing is this morning we are getting word that the Mosul Dam is apparently being attacked by American forces, and American forces that is from the air. And they're doing this in concert, potentially in concert with the Peshmerga forces, which are the Kurdish forces. So what that means is that ISIS, or the Islamic State, depending on how you want to call them, they've captured a lot of the infrastructure in this part of Iraq, in this northern northwestern part of Iraq. And the Mosul Dam is the largest dam in the country of Iraq. It basically, there's a huge lake that's behind it, and it's part of the dam system of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And it gives not only a lot of electrical power to the entire nation of Iraq, but it also serves to control flooding in both the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. So the importance of controlling the dams that the Islamic State or ISIS is doing right now, the reason they're doing this is they're trying to gain leverage, and they're trying to not only gain territory, but gain coercive power over the rest of the nation of Iraq, the part that they don't control. And that includes the city of Baghdad and everything that lies south of there. So when you look at a map of Iraq, especially the southeastern part of the country around Basra and everything south and east of Baghdad, that is all a very, very important area, both in terms of population, in terms of agricultural production, and basically in terms of the economy of the state of Iraq. So what the folks in the Islamic State are doing, the terrorists in the Islamic State are doing, is they're trying to control all of the means of production by controlling the water flow. And in the Middle East, because it's such a dry place, water flow is basically the most important thing to control from a strategic standpoint. Now, when you step back a bit and look at what has happened before this point, of course, there was a lot of talk about Mount Sinjar and the Yazidi minority. The Yazidi minority is an independent religion not affiliated with Christianity, Islam, or any of the other religions, with the exception of Zoroastrianism in the ancient world. And the Yazidi minority is one that the Islamic State has targeted for elimination. So the importance of what happened at Mount Sinjar was that it was seen as a point of refuge for the Yazidi minority and for some other minorities, Christians, some Iraqi Shiites, and others were congregating there, but predominantly was the Yazidi minority. And the fact that many of them were able to escape from Mount Sinjar basically was seen by the administration here in Washington as being in essence a victory for them in the short term, because it didn't require a humanitarian or a further humanitarian effort such as a mass evacuation of personnel. And so far they've told us that because there are far fewer Yazidis, an estimate was around 4,000 or so, as opposed to 10 to 20,000, which were the previous estimates, because there are 4,000 or fewer Yazidis on Mount Sinjar right now. The basic idea is that there is no requirement for there to be an airlift operation to remove those people from there. Now, there are other reports from the United Nations and from other people on the ground that dispute the administration's account. Basically, the United Nations has declared this a stage 3 humanitarian crisis. A stage 3 humanitarian crisis is the highest level of humanitarian crisis within the UN order of magnitude for such things. And that shows that the UN is concerned that any type of genocidal moves on the part of the Islamic State are going to take place, whether it's on Mount Sinjar or in other places. And in fact, there's a village not far from Mount Sinjar in which it is alleged that the Islamic State may have massacred the men and basically enslaved the women and children of that village, and it was a Yazidi village. So these are very serious allegations, and even if the numbers are in historical terms, relatively small. If you eliminate a group of people, it's technically and legally considered to be genocide, and that's what the administration said it is trying to avoid. The Mount Sinjar operation appears to have worked in terms of both dropping humanitarian aid supplies to the people that were there, but also in terms of what we call in the military interdicting the lines of fight, basically, that the Islamic State has. So what they're doing is they're using targeted airstrikes to go after the artillery emplacements of the Islamic State, and that works up to a point. The problem with the strategy as it's unfolding right now is that it really doesn't get into the actual hearts and minds of the people that are there, and so it's very hard to affect hearts and minds of the people that are on the ground, especially those that are supporting the Islamic State, just using air power. And that's really what we're dealing with here, is the fact that air power is, the principal and sole source of power that the United States is exercising right now. Now, of course, the Peshmerga, the Kurdish forces, they have ground forces, and that's their principal means of exercising military power, and they've had some difficulties doing that, but they have, with the airstrikes, they have been able to gain some ground against the Islamic State, so it remains to be seen how far they can take that and how much more support they need from other countries, including the United States, to do what they want to do, which is to protect their region of Kurdistan, which is a semi-autonomous region of Iraq. And that is actually basically one success story in the post-Saddam Iraq, and the United States is bent on making that work in a way that they can actually keep that success story going. And that's why the Kurdish piece is very important to the United States and to the West in general.
So you've mentioned a number of different things here, supporting the Kurdish military, winning hearts and minds, stopping genocide, and protecting the dam in Mosul and the water supply and electricity. What exactly is the U.S.'s goal in terms of this military involvement, and has it broadened since the initial airstrikes?
Well, I think the goal is kind of hard to discern because we don't have a publicly available strategy that is understood by people outside of the Pentagon and outside of the military. So the way I discern the strategy right now is, first of all, avoid a humanitarian disaster, number one. Number two, protect Kurdistan, and then number three, actually safeguard the Iraqi state. So in some ways, goals 2 and 3 conflict with each other, because a Kurdistan that is not only semi-autonomous but may even graduate from semi-autonomy to some degree of independence, that it actually is part of the possible dismemberment of the Iraqi state. And if you dismember the Iraqi state, then from a political standpoint, you've got a problem, because all of a sudden you have nothing to balance against Iran, nothing to balance against Iran, potentially, or against other countries like Syria and even potentially Turkey in that region. And so there's a huge diplomatic issue involved. Now, of course, if the United States becomes closer to Iran, which is possible through some of these operations here, and I can explain in a bit what that really means, if the United States becomes closer to Iran politically or militarily, then that could be a game changer in terms of how Middle Eastern politics and diplomacy is actually conducted. And if that happens, and if we believe that that could work, then there could be some degree of change in the way we approach Iraq and what kind of Iraq, if any, comes out of this particular situation.
Let's turn to our phone lines now. We'll hear first from Jeff, who is in Wauwaka, Indiana, on the independent line. Jeff, what's your question this morning?
Hey, thanks for having me on. Colonel, thanks for your service. I always appreciate your clarity on many of these topics wherever I see you in the media.
Thank you, Jeff.
First, I think people, I read it, and my son's involved with Special Forces. He's been in Africa from time to time. I think you know what they do down there, trying to work with hearts and minds and local military forces, trying to ramp them up at all levels to defend themselves. I read an interesting book I'm sure you've heard of, Killer Elite, by Michael Smith. Oh, that maybe came out 10 plus years ago. Yeah. And I think some people have to realize that maybe what we hear on the media might be 10% of what you folks in the special ops or the intelligence community really know what's going on. I hope in the future, moving forward, as you're talking about hearts and minds, we can continue to team up with other worldwide special forces, France, Germany, Australia, etc. Because as we can use these folks, we're in the information age. As we can use these folks, we can kind of keep our, let's say, boots on the ground at an arm's distance and use our air forces, worldwide special forces, and so on to stay ahead of the people that do want to do us harm. And I'll just leave it at that and take your answer off the air. Thanks for your service again.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks so much. And you have that's an excellent point, because the special forces of the world are a unique community. And you mentioned, some of the special forces, such as the Germans, the British, the French. They are all excellent at what they do. They have certain core competencies or some variations of core competencies, which in some cases are somewhat similar, but they are very, very effective in special operations missions. The fact that not only is it important to work with special forces of this type, but it's also important to grow other special forces throughout the world. And what that really means is developing those kinds of capabilities in nations that are friendly to us. And that includes, potentially the Kurdish Peshmerga special forces element of that. Certainly the Turkish special forces, we also have a relationship with them. And that can be very, very useful, because when you engage special forces, it becomes a very good way in which to affect not only hearts and minds, but even military outcomes without putting massive amounts of boots on the ground, without expending large, vast sums of money. And it's usually, if it's done correctly and the policy and the strategy match, it's usually a very, very good way in which to actually go in and influence events without having to really deploy the vast resources of an entire nation. And that's why special forces are good from an operational standpoint. And of course, you touched on the intelligence piece. They are also very, very good from an intelligence standpoint, because they are the eyes and ears, in essence, on the ground, or can be the eyes and ears on the ground, because not only are they interacting with the population in these areas, but they're also interacting with the militaries both on the friendly side and on the opposing side, and that becomes a critical area in which to work and affect outcomes. And yeah, absolutely, special forces coupled with air power is an exceedingly strong combination if the training is right, if the equipment is right, and if the resourcing is right for those elements.
Do you think this conflict will eventually reach the point where the U.S. will have to send boots on the ground?
I think it's possible. And, I hate to say that, because, of course, that is almost like a third rail of politics, when you start talking about that. But the administration made a mistake in saying that boots on the ground were automatically off the table. They might want to have boots on the ground off the table forever. And, that's certainly a laudable and legitimate goal to have. But when you say something like that publicly, it tells the enemy what you're going to do. And you should be very, very careful. There's always the political imperative, especially here in Washington, but then there's also the strategic and the military imperative that foreign audiences, especially enemy audiences, see. And in many cases, you have to remember that you're playing to both audiences, and sometimes you need to take the role of the enemy audience and bring that up to a higher level and talk to them in a way that, quite frankly, instills fear in them and makes them guess what we're going to do next. And we have not been very good at doing that, at least in recent years.
On Twitter, Joseph Hill writes,